Be handy, you can definitely get that printed out. Leon with the cities also recorded me a few weeks ago doing line-by-line instructions of this report, and he will have that video posted on their website later today. So if I don't cover something you have more questions on, you can refer to that video. And if you have questions, please ask them. I'll try and stop after each section. So we'll stop after the revenue, the expense, and then at the end. And I'll try and address questions as we go so there aren't a bunch of them at the end. But again, that line-by-line instruction will be online today on the city's website. And we'll try and get it sent out to each of the associations. So there's a link, and we'll try and get some information out from us as well about that. So let's get started. So the Road and Street Finance Report, again, this is the first year that we've made changes to the report as long as I have known about the report. So we want to make sure we cover those changes. Also the instructions, we updated them. We added some more information, some good examples with those instructions to help guide you as you're completing the report. And then we'll cover the House Bill 312 revenue and the reporting for that. Most of you know that Idaho Code requires you to complete the Road and Street Finance Report yearly, and it's due to the state controller by December 31st every year. After it goes to the controller, ITD receives the report. They actually compile all the information from the report, and then page 3 comes to LTAC. And we compile that information for reporting to the legislature, so we have that information throughout the year. The report enables you to receive your HDA disbursements, which are 4 times a year. The first one is October, January, April, and July. And this first disbursement in October, you did receive your additional HB 312 money, and we'll talk about later how you need to separate that out and make sure you report on how those funds were spent within a year. So you may not have any money to report for last year, but it's important you track it for fiscal year 16, so when you get to the end of the year, you can accurately report how you spent that money. This year, during fiscal year 16, that first payment in October was lower than your remaining payments will be. Okay. I think we lost you. Lost video and sound. I'm out. When did they lose me?
Was it you?
Just a minute ago.
Okay. Yeah, just a second, yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I think we're back. I'm not quite sure where I lost you. Let's go up a slide maybe. Okay, so again, if this is repeating, I apologize, but just again, emphasizing that this report is due per Idaho Code for you to receive your HDA funds each year, and it is due to the state controller by December 31st. ITD gets the reports after the controller, and they compile the information and then put those spreadsheets up online. We receive page 3, and that page 3, we compile that information, and we present that information to the legislature as they have questions every year. So every year you get 4 disbursements from the HDA fund, October, January, April, and July. In October, you received your first payment from the House Bill 312 funds, and this year, it'll be about a 25% increase from your fiscal year 2014 revenue. Every year after will be about a 30% increase. And part of this is due to the lag in the collection of revenue and taxes that we have, just due to the nature of trying to get those funds gathered and reconciled. You can get the information from the ITD website, and it's pretty simple on their homepage. If you go to their website under About Us, there's a link called Economic and Research. You click on that, and it opens this page. And on the left, you can see I've highlighted the current quarterly distribution. And what this says is that it will give you the breakout of what payments were made for each quarter from the original highway user revenue funds, and then also that House Bill 312 funds. So I just took the top page of the report here to show you that Adams County received $217,000 from their typical highway user revenue funds, but then that House Bill 312 money gave them that additional $24,959. So again, that will increase as the year goes, because this first payment from the House Bill 312 will be the lowest payment that you receive from those funds. So getting into the report, we're going to start just on the top of the first page. When you look at the top right-hand corner, every box that I've circled in red will be a change we made to the actual report this year. So on the first page, those boxes were blank before. We just helped say these are for commission signatures. If you have all three of your commissioners sign it, we just want to kind of note that so you know what those boxes are intended for. And then starting with line 1, the beginning balance, make sure that you're pulling it from your prior report on line 64, and just bring that over to line 1, and you can start completing the report. There were no changes really in terms of the local funding sources. These all stayed the same for the year, but I do want to point out again, we added those extra instructions and we tried to put examples of what kinds of funds you might put in here. And if you have a question ever about, I don't quite know where I should put this revenue, then please feel free to email myself, Kathy Smith at ITD. We'd be happy to help you answer any of those questions. Technical difficulty. Okay, under, again, the local funding source, we just want to point out that we added that information with the instructions. No changes in this revenue area. Under the state funding sources, the first thing we did change was line 12. We just clarified the wording for the highway user revenue. So on this line, you're going to put in all the funds you receive from the HUR funds. So these are your quarterly payments from the state for that revenue. This will include your House Bill 312 money in fiscal year 16, and just make sure you list them all in that first line. And we changed the wording to better represent what money you were actually receiving. I'm having technical issues. Just a moment, sorry. It's not clicking. Nope. We're trying, sorry. Okay, line 15, state exchange funds. So we changed the wording on this line because what this is intended for is just for the LRIP funds from LTAC. So if you receive an LRIP grant from LTAC, the year that we actually issue the check and you receive those funds, you will list them on line 15. So we just reworded that line so that you would understand specifically what that line is intended for. Under the federal funding sources, a couple changes, major changes here. Line 18 through 21, we did change the name of the lines. The Secure Rural Schools, we wanted to clarify the wording on that. It did have a different name before, so we wanted to make sure that you understand that we're looking for the SRS funds that are only for your highways. A lot of people have Craig-Wyden funding. This is also formerly known as the National Funds Revenue Apportionment. So any funding you receive, you'll list on line 18. On line 19, 20, and 21, those are all for your federal aid projects. What we're asking for on this as a clarification are those funds that you are getting reimbursed. When you do a federal aid project that LTAC administers, you pay the consultant, you reimburse a consultant for the work they're doing, the engineering they're doing on your project. You then submit your invoices and you get reimbursed at 92.66% of what you have paid that engineer. So you're gonna list according to what type of project it is. If it's bridge, rural, or urban, you're gonna list that 92.66% you're reimbursed on the appropriate line. This is something that it's confusing, and I always tell people that if you get a federal aid project, that would be a great time to reach out and get clarification and understand that process and how you record that funding when you're filling out your road and street report, because it can be a little confusing the first time you go through a federal aid program with us. Urban highway districts will never have an urban program, and so just know that if you're a highway district, you're only going to be using the bridge or the rural funding source under federal aid. And then on line 22, again, we changed the definition just to the federal lands access and all other federal funding programs. So in this line, there are going to be a lot of funding categories that could be included. It could be PILT, it could be federal ER funds, FEMA funds. If you receive a local highway safety improvement grant through LTAC, so a safety grant, if you get any of that reimbursed money that you get from invoices for an engineer will be listed on this line, along with any public lands discretionary, federal lands access. There's a whole list of federal funding that could be listed on this other federal lands, other federal receipts line. So that kind of wraps up the receipts or the revenue area, and we'll move into the expenses side. On the expenses, on page 2 of the report, it starts out with the new construction. And in that new construction, one of the big changes we have this year on the road and street report is that for the new construction, the reconstruction, rehabilitation, and the routine maintenance categories, which are those top 3 categories on the expense side, we're asking you to include your salaries and benefits for the work performed under each of those lines. This is partially because each jurisdiction was doing it a little differently before. Some people were just lumping all their salary and benefits under administration. Some people were putting in others were breaking it out by the line. So we just want to be consistent across the board with the jurisdictions. And I understand that not everyone has a project cost accounting software, or you may not code it. And what I've said is just be consistent. However you're reporting that salary, those benefits for your employees, as long as you consistently report it the same way, that's all we can ask for. The other change in each of these 3 categories is on the other line. We've included the wording signs, signals, or traffic control. So under new construction, if you're adding some traffic control, you're adding a signal, whatever you're doing for that type of work, we want you to break that out on that other line. There was no place on the road and street report to really specify that information before, and so we want to make sure we're capturing that expense for each of these categories. So again, reconstruction, rehabilitation, just like new construction, you're going to include the salary and benefits on each line. And then on that other, the line 33, you're going to include any signs, signals, and traffic control. Routine maintenance, again, we're asking for the salary and benefits like I mentioned. And then on line 37, we did update the wording to be winter maintenance. On the prior report, it said snow removal. And we know that you do much more than just remove snow in the winter time. So we wanted to make sure we updated that wording so you understand we're looking for any type of work you're doing during the winter time to maintain your roadways. And then line 40, again, we want to capture any type of maintenance you're doing for your signs, your signals, your traffic control on that line 40. On line 43, we just updated the wording. This is the equipment section for the report, and we just updated the wording for equipment lease to purchase. So this would be when you're purchasing a piece of equipment, a grader, by making lease payments. We want you to list whatever those are for the year on this line. In this category, you also have your equipment maintenance and then any other type of work you do. Line 47, I want to point out, I have a lot of questions on this line. This is for the administrative salaries and expenses. So this would be your admin staff. Maybe you have a clerk or a treasurer or other admin staff that does not work on projects specifically, build to projects specifically. Then their time, their labor, their salary, their benefits, all of those items would be included on line 47. It's also going to include any of your overhead costs. So this would be your building cost, any power, gas, lights, office supplies. Those types of things will be included in this administrative salary and expense. This category is much easier for a highway district than it is for a city or county who is looking at costs for several departments instead of just looking at really those costs that are associated with the roadways. So this is kind of a catch-all again for those overhead costs, the administrative costs for your road and bridge departments. And then there is a list of other expenditures. We did not make any changes in this area. The two things I want to point out are line 51 and 52. These are for professional services. We asked you to list on line 51 any professional services. It could include your audit, your clerical, legal expenses, any other type of professional services you're paying. On line 52, we specifically call out your engineering professional services, partially because when you're doing a federal aid project, you're showing the reimbursement of 92.66 on the revenue side, but we want to be able to show 100% of that expense. Additionally, I think it's important for us to capture how much you're paying in engineering services for your roadways in a year. That is a very specific task and specific work that they're doing for you for your roadways. So we want to make sure you split out engineering and then all other professional services you can list on that line 51. And again, the rest of the expenses, there's a whole list of them, including redemption of notes and your bonds and different items, including your fund transfers to non-highway accounts. So this is the place where if on your revenue side you have transferred any general funds in out years, if you're moving that money back to that general fund, you would simply list it here. And then you total your expenditures there. On line 61, you get your total disbursements, and then you go down the list and you have your receipts over disbursements and then your closing balance. On your closing balance, line 64, you want to make sure that you equal 0 or greater. You cannot have a negative on this line. The reason being that at the end of the year, you may have a loss for the year, but you don't have a negative in your bank account. So you want to make sure that you have a 0 or greater on line 64. And you do carry that line 64 closing balance over to next year's beginning balance number. We do have a question, so real quickly, let's just answer this. The question is, would that be the salaries of our engineering department that worked on roads or just those paid to consultants? So this is referring to that, I'll just look really quickly, the line 52. So the line 52, thank you, for the professional services for engineering, this would just be for those outside consultants. Typically for your engineering staff that are salaried within your department, if you can break those charges out to the category that's appropriate, new construction, reconstruction, or maintenance, or any of the time that you can't break out to those categories, then you could list them on your administrative salaries and expenses or line 47. And hopefully that clarifies and answers that question for you. Okay. Line 65, I'm going to go over a little bit. So line 65 is a very important line in my mind because this is where you can put those funds that you have on line 64 that you have obligated for specific future projects. So when you get your ending balance, you realize that there is money in that ending balance that you're either reserving for projects or for general operations. Line 65 on page 3, you can actually list out what those projects are you're reserving funds from line 64 on. From. So you can also list any reserves that you have for large purchases. So this might be a small jurisdiction is saving money to purchase a new snowplow. Well, you might list that, we have $100,000 in line 64, but $50,000 of it is for purchasing a snowplow in the fall of 2017, whatever that is. And there's room on that line, on that page 3 to give line by line information to what the project name is. You can put when you expect to do it or the year it's slated for, and then how much of that line 64 is reserved for that specific project. Another example is for federal aid projects, you have to pay a 7.34% match up front. A lot of jurisdictions, you have about 5 years, give or take, to save for that. Save a little every year to pay their match on their project. So again, you would just want to list, this is reserved for this federal aid project. Just put the name, the year it's slated to begin, and how much you have currently set aside. Line 66 is where you can list those funds that are in line 64 that you're retaining for your general funds and operations. Most jurisdictions, their accounting, auditor, their commissioners, their council, whoever has established either an amount, a number of months, a percentage that they need to hold in reserves for general funds and operations. So on line 66, you just want to make sure you list out of the money in 64 how much you have set aside for those reserves. And then on line 67, you're simply taking 64, subtracting out 65 and 66, so what you have set aside for projects, reserves, general funds, and operations to give you your ending balance. If you've seen me do presentations on the Road and Street before, I talk about the LRIP application a lot. And part of it is because this line 67 has to be 0 in order to be awarded some points on an LRIP application. It is also a number that the legislature looks at. They have access to the Road and Street report information just like anyone else from ITD's website. And sometimes they'll look at it and say, the local jurisdictions are showing they have all this money set aside available in their ending balance, so why would additional funds be needed? So we really want to emphasize line 65, 66, the importance and looking at the money that you have at the end of the year and how that money is actually obligated for future years. We're going to move on to page 3. So if there are any questions on the revenue or expenses, this is a good time to kind of stop. I don't see any, so I think we'll just keep going. So on page 3, this is the sheet that LTAC receives from the Road and Street report. The top part of the page, we asked for some reporting measures. Partially, this is so we have the information of how many lane miles, bridge deck are constructed every year, and how much is being reconstructed, rehabbed, or maintained within a year. So lines 68, 70, and 72, all 3 of those lines, we are really asking for total lane miles. So make sure when you look at total lane miles that you're looking at 1 mile of a 4 lane road equals 4 lane miles. So remember that when you're calculating those total lane miles for each of these categories. And then on 69 and 71, we're asking for the total square feet of bridge deck. either constructed or rehabilitated. And then line 73, we want to know how many lane miles have you graded or bladed within the year. And so this isn't for winter maintenance, snow removal, it's how many times have you actually done grading or blading on those lanes. The second section of page 3 we talked about a little. This is where you list those future projects and reserves from line 65. And then you can get a total of those projects. And then the bottom of page 3 is the new section of the Road and Street report that we've added for the House Bill 312. So the House Bill 312 funding, again, is that increase in the gas tax and registration that the legislature enacted during last session, so in the spring of 2015. So it increased the gas tax by 7 cents a gallon, increased registration about $25 a car. So you got your first disbursement for the House Bill 312 money in October. If you are an accrual basis, you may consider that money part of your fiscal year 2015 funding. And if that's the case, you will report just that first quarter of funding in this section for your 2015 Road and Street report. If you're cash basis, you're going to count it as your 2016 revenue. And even with some of those accrual jurisdictions, we've seen where they actually count as 2016 revenue, and that is just fine. So on this section, we just want to emphasize that in the legislative intent of House Bill 312, it specifically states that LTAC has to collect the reporting information for the revenue and how those funds were expended, on what type of maintenance those funds were expended in the year. Additionally, for line 85, we ask for your deferred maintenance costs over the last 5 years. In the legislative intent, the legislature states we have to also provide the ongoing maintenance need for local highway jurisdictions in the state of Idaho. So we're going to go through this section, but no, we're asking this information because we have been directed, according to the legislation, that we need to collect this information. So on the House Bill 312 funding, just looking at the top couple lines, what we've tried to do is simplify it. So on line 77, we're just simply saying, list how much of the House Bill 312 money you have collected for the year. And then you're going to go through the information and explain to us what you did. There's a question asking if you have to report the revenue on both lines 12 and 77, and you do, which is kind of duplicative, but the reason is the first 2 pages of the Road and Street is a whole picture of all the funding, where this section is just specifically to that House Bill 312. So what I've suggested to a lot of people is even setting up a new general ledger account just for this funding separately, so that you're able to track how much you get and then associating costs however you do and what's easiest for you throughout the year. So on the top, the few first lines you see, we just have given, examples of maintenance that you could be doing in the year. And then we're asking for how much was spent on that activity, and then also a description of the work. So line 78, rehabilitation of road. We have rehabilitation and maintenance of a bridge, and chip sealing or seal coating. And then further down, we have grading, blading, striping, traffic control, and all other maintenance. So we'll just take 83 as our example. If I received in the year $20,000 and I did traffic control, then I would list I spent my $20,000 on traffic control, and I would list exactly what I did. So maybe I changed a traffic pattern. I added some new stop signs. I added some new warning signs, whatever that would be. And I could list that out and say, added some curve ahead signs on half a mile of Main Street. The reason we're asking for a description of the work is so if a legislature specifically says, I want to know the work that was done in our area, or even the Highway District Association they may come to us and say, we want to know how this House Bill 312 money was spent by our highway districts. We want to be able to give them a number, but also a description, because that makes a lot more sense to some people. Saying $20,000 on traffic control doesn't make much sense unless we can explain to them how much work was actually done with that money. So we're asking for both what kind of work you did, the amount spent, and a description. And if you mark the all other maintenance, that description is really going to be important so that we understand what you did. We've had a lot of questions about the definition of maintenance, and it's very broad. So our explanation is, please look at it as improving, maintaining, repairing something that is already existing for you. Some road and bridge departments actually maintain the gutters, the sidewalks, the culverts. Well, if that's part of your department and that's maintenance for you, then absolutely that's an allowable expense with this House Bill 312 funding. The last line, line 85, again, we're just asking for that 5-year deferred maintenance cost. And this is just to give us a snapshot of how much you're delaying in projects in 5 years due to a lack of funding. This might be gathered by looking at a capital improvement plan, transportation plan, or just simply looking at what you have planned for out years that you've delayed in prior years due to not having additional funding to do the actual work. At this point, I'm open for questions, if there are any. And I'm going to put my contact information. It looks like we have a question. Let me scroll up a little. Oh, thank you for asking that question about they were accrued into 2015, but the funds have not been spent yet. So what we're asking you to do in that case, and just show it for the online 77 as you have received it, and then just tell us what you plan to do. So maybe you plan to do additional chip sealing, just mark that box, tell us you're planning to do chip sealing spring of 2016 or whatever that activity might be. I'm going to scroll a little so I can make sure I see everything people are asking. The contact information, so I can see maybe if Leon could send that out to everyone. So if there are questions, Laura, I know has all my information also. For leaf pickup out of curb and gutter lines. So the street funds, can street funds be used for leaf pickup? So this is if this is a maintenance activity that your road and street crew does, then absolutely it can be used for that. Looks like we have another question coming in too. I would say, as I went through this too, I want to make the comment, if there are things that you wish were broken out separately or changes to the road and street report, I am always open to looking at improving or changing it going forward. So also, please always send me an email. My information is on the LTAC website. So if you ever do forget, just simply go to our website, and under the staff, you can actually link to my email, or we have the same phone number for everybody in our office because Nancy at our front desk answers all of our phone calls. The website so it says, can you review again the website on LTAC where they show the different amounts for House Bill 312? I can. Do I have internet on this computer? Okay. Let me actually, oh, it won't work. Let me go back. I'm not plugged in, I just realized, sorry. So let me go back to ITD's website. On my slideshow, it's back quite a ways. Let me get back there. So ITD's website is itd.idaho.gov. And when you go to their main page, they have a gray bar across the top of it. And I'll show it to you. But there's a category that says About Us on it. And under that About Us is where you find that information. It's just taking a minute to get there. And I will tell you, there's a lot more information on this website than what I touched on. So this is so again, this is the main page. Under About Us is that Economic and Research. And when you click on Economic and Research, it opens this page. And there's a lot more information than what I covered on this website. So the current quarterly distribution, if you click there, it will show you just what was distributed in the last payment. So currently it's for October, and then in January, it'll switch to just January's distribution. But there's also information on here under the highway user revenue. You can look at each year, all of those disbursements. And then there's also a place where you can actually search for your old road and street finance reports. There's a compilation of the website of all the reports. So there's a lot of information on that site. And I've done a lot of digging myself just to go through and look at how are people reporting things? Does this make sense? And maybe even looking at what are people's closing balances in the past. So if by chance you don't have a copy of prior road and street reports, if you're a newer clerk that's doing the work, then you can go and actually pull the information yourself. So the current quarterly distribution Leon's pulling up, and it shows what was sent out in October, and it lists the counties first, and then the highway districts. Yes, and then the cities are last. And it is just by each jurisdiction. And it shows you the two columns, what you receive from your typical highway user revenue with your House Bill 312, and then the total amount you received for that quarter. If you go back, Leon, to that main page, and then click on local roads a little further down. So under local roads, this is a great resource. So you can actually search by jurisdiction to find old road and street reports. You can find the compiled information in Excel spreadsheet. This is also where the report and the instructions are. So if you want to download it and you can save it electronically as an Excel format, you can get it here, save it. There's also a road mileage report by jurisdiction on this site. So there's a lot of information just on ITD's website. Are there any more questions? Oh, that looks like we have another one coming in. And again, if you haven't seen the instructions, make sure you go pull them off the ITD website because they have a lot of good information this year. Laura just asked, what is the deadline again? The deadline to turn it in is December 31st to the controller. If you do not turn your road and street report in, you will not be receiving your highway user revenue money in January. So make sure you get it turned into the controller by December 31st. I don't know if we have any more questions. Do you want to say anything, Leon?
Just if they have any comments about the webinar, email them to me.
Okay. If you have any, Leon just wanted me to let you know, if you have any comments about the webinar itself, please email Leon and let him know, good or bad, or he's open to that feedback since I know this is a new system. So, okay, well, thank you for your time. And again, if you need anything else, please call or email me or Kathy Smith at ITD, and we'd be happy to answer any questions.